Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Deal, where we discuss business, entrepreneurship, and commercial real estate. My name is Lacey Labs, and I'm here with my co-host, Laura Martin. In today's episode, we interviewed Angela Price, owner of Juniper Environmental. Angela created Juniper to be an independent and objective resource for commercial, industrial, and agricultural property investors or buyers. She has spent over 18 years in the environmental field, working on a diverse portfolio of projects, ranging from the small mom-and-pop corner store to large industrial sites, to even assisting on the Incident Command Center during the BP oil spill cleanup as a quality control manager. Tune into this episode to hear more about Angela's business journey, the land development and environmental experiences that she shares, and what advice she would give to developers, investors, and construction professionals. Angela Price, welcome to Beyond the Deal. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Glad you're here.
So let's get started. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you kind of got started in environmental field work.
Sure. So I have an undergrad in environmental biology and graduate in environmental health and engineering. Okay. So that's how I got started, right? You gotta try to use your education. Yeah. So I started doing all scopes of environmental work, remediation, building demolition, right? Tank pulls, all the fun stuff. I did that for about 10 to 11 years. And then I moved to a company where we focused on just the due diligence portion of the work. So then when I started my business just over 3 years ago, I decided that I was going to also focus on that due diligence portion of the work. So really my background comes from my education and then my level of experience doing different phases and, remediation work.
Okay, awesome. So tell us a little bit more, assume we don't know what you're talking about. What exactly is it that you do? Tell us about your job. Feel free to get technical and specific. What does your day-to-day look like? What is the due diligence part of your work? How does that tie to real estate and land development and buildings? And just go ahead. It can be as long as you want. Tell us what you got going on here.
So I do some educational events similar, and I like to look at my audience and say, okay, who actually knows what a phase one is, right? How many of you read one before? Yeah. And then I can gauge what my response will be. But I'll just assume that nobody raised their hand. Mm-hmm. And so my focus is phase ones, phase twos. So that environmental due diligence portion, of course, that includes other levels of environmental consulting. But technically, phase one is done when someone's going to purchase a property. Sometimes it's tenant financing. It should also be done for cash deals as well. It's done for commercial and industrial uses, so non-residential. Now, of course, you guys know as being involved in the real estate world, that also is multifamily and apartment buildings and development from residential or from farm or vacant land to residential. Still falls under the commercial use. Right. So a phase one is when you go out to a property, you visit it, you walk around, you look in every nook and cranny behind every door. You're pretty nosy, right? I usually preface my visit with the owners or whoever's there saying, I'm going to be nosy. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions that you're probably going to get annoyed with. You may not know the answers. That's okay. You have to look in as many lids as you can, right? If you're going to open something, you need to see what's in there. So then that experience of doing some of that previous environmental remediation type work lends well into saying, why I know what that is because I've cleaned up after that before. And so that's kind of the actual site visit part, right? You just look at everything. Part. Yeah, the detective part. So you look in the building, outside of the building, all around the property. And you also have to kind of take a peek at the adjacent properties while you're there. So that's really the field part. And the rest of it, which is the most, I'll say, intensive part, is research. It's mostly desktop work or going to the DEP's office to look at their files. So it includes looking at the property as far back in time as possible to pre-development, which isn't always possible, but it does take you into 1800s, right? You're looking at old topo maps, old atlas maps, Sanborn maps, which are my personal favorite. So if you don't know what those are, they're fire insurance maps. So the fire departments back in the day used to write, here's a building, here's how it's heated, or here's a gas tank, or this is what the use was. But a lot of times it's more, was it domestic? Was it a store? When was it built? Sometimes they'll have a notation as to when it was built. They're really only in more developed areas. Places have been developed for a really long time. So in cities, you won't see them in agricultural or rural areas. Aerial photographs, so they're always fun to try to interpret what was there. And so those are kind of the maps that we look at. We also have to review local, state, and federal records. So city, township, county, Pennsylvania DEP, sometimes health department, and the EPA records. So if they're available, we have to look at them, and we have to look for them. So we can't just say, they're probably not there. You have to actually look for them. That's the most intensive part, right? Just trying to find these records. And then if they have them, you have to actually go look at them. And it's not just for the property itself. It's for anything adjacent or nearby that we think might be impacting it. And we get a lot of that information from a records search, which is a third-party search typically done. You guys probably know it's EDR or ARIS or First Search. And they provide us records for things that have been reported. So, if it's been reported, they should have a record of it. They have ties to the DEP and the EPA, so they kind of have those records. They're all public knowledge. It's just easier to get them from one place than to search in every single individual database. So that's our third-party database search. Let's see if I've covered pretty much everything. And then you have to summarize it all, put it into a report, which sadly is like 40 pages sometimes, just the report itself. But then all that stuff has to be attached to it. So they can get pretty big. But if you're doing these consistently, you know that there's an executive summary usually at the beginning that says, here's what the problems are. So that's what a phase one is. And I always call it is there a potential for concern phase, right? Do we think there might be an issue? Which leads into the phase two portion. So that's the intensive, destructive portion, right? So we're going to drill in the ground. We're going to collect soils or groundwater, maybe an indoor air sample if absolutely necessary. Maybe additional investigation. So it's not remediation. It's not delineation. We're not going to tell you how big the problem is. We're going to go straight to the hottest spot where we think it's going to be the worst and collect a sample. I always call it the presence or absence test. Is there a problem or isn't there? It's not going to tell you, like I said, how big the problem is. So if you decide that you don't want to buy the property because you found there is an issue, you can back out without spending all the money it would take to delineate that problem. We could say, we think there might be a tank here underground, and we would bring geophysics out, which is like ground radar, and we would run it over it and see, is there a tank there? Some people, that might be enough. There's a tank there. I want nothing to do with it. Other people might say, well, let's collect some samples around it, see if it's leaked. That's going to be still in the phase one. If you get to the point where you're pulling the tank out, that's beyond, phase two. Get to the point where you're pulling the tank out, that's beyond a phase two, and that turns into something more. So my portion of the work typically stops there. There's a reason for that. At this point, obviously, it's a small business, right? You only have so many hands. But it also gives me the ability to say to my clients, I'm comfortable with where we're at. How do you want to proceed? Do you want to go to a company to remediate this? Do you want to talk to an engineer to plan for how to work around it? There are some things that you can benefit from being more of a consultant on the consultant side. So I think that's hopefully answers what your question is.
So you can consult beyond a phase two.
Yes.
There's further things. And a phase one is typically the buyer's paying for it, but the bank usually requires it.
Yes.
And then you send your report to the bank and the buyer, or how does that work?
The report goes to whoever the client is. Okay. So I always suggest that the person buying the property that's going to hold the title, right? Like whoever that person is the one listed on the report. Oftentimes, if a bank hires me to do it, sorry, bank guys, the bank hires me to do it, it's only going to the bank. and they're going to have it. And when you pay off that mortgage, you don't get a copy of it. So it's smart, even though they are paying for it, right? They should be listed as a user. So the user is the only one that gets the liability protection that comes from doing, and now I'm going to get technical, an ASTM 1527 compliant report. And that was just recently updated in 21. So everybody should be using 1527-21 now. So if you see 13, kick it back and say, no, thank you. Fix this. So the user is the only one that gets that protection. So whoever is going to be the owner of that property should be the one listed on the cover. You can list more than one person on the cover or, as the user. So it's important for them to know that they should have that document in hand. So it is usually done and paid for by the buyer of the property.
So if I was buying a building and the seller handed me a phase one, do you still have to redo a phase one, or is that something where you can review that and then just comment on it? Or
right. So phase ones technically are only good for 6 months.
Okay.
So it's the way that the standard is written is it's 6 months from closing. So you count backwards 6 months, and the phase one is still good. You still have coverage. You can still be listed as the user. If it's within that 6 months, you can ask for a user reliance letter. And if the seller who did the phase one, sometimes they'll do them to prep for sale, right? I want this to be a smooth process. If they're comfortable with it, and they will ask their consultant who did the phase one to write a user reliance letter. And there's a very small fee associated with that. Very small compared to the cost of a phase one. So, rather do that than do a whole new one, right? And the time constraint. So you can be listed as a new user on
if it's
that
in 6
phase
months,
one, if it's within that
which
6
is
months.
Probably not.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah.
6 months to a year, you're technically supposed to do an update, which is a new database pull, and a couple other things thrown in there to make sure that nothing has changed on the property and nothing's changed nearby. So 6 months to a year out. After a year, you have to do a completely whole new phase one.
Okay.
So that's kind of the time frame of it.
So you do the site visit, and then is it pretty much all online apps and databases that you're going to compared to, things have gotten a lot better where things are online versus having to go.
Yes, a lot of things are now online. The DEP, depending on what region you're going to, and the MDE, so, we're close enough to Maryland. I'll throw Maryland in there as well. Most of their stuff is electronically created, right? So some of them they've scanned in. Like if you went to Southeast PA, they're going to say, here are your files. You don't even need to come in typically. South Central, they're more half and half. Sometimes they will scan it and send it to you. If it's a lot of files, you have to go in person and look at them. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you get a microfiche file.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you used to have like interviews, right? You'd have what they called a DEP interview.
Yeah.
So it's gotten better, which is good. It
has gotten better. Yeah, you actually look at the records in person. Sometimes you do contact the case manager to see if they have any additional information.
It's interesting because what phase ones cost, it sounds like a lot of work.
It is
when you think about it.
It is a lot of work, yeah. The sad thing is it's being turned into a commodity, right? So just people kind of the lowest cost. And we're environmental professionals. We have the requirement to do a phase one is you have to have. There's varying ways, but the most common way to be considered an environmental professional is to have a 4-year degree in the applicable science field and 5 years experience working under another EP. Yeah. So you have a degree and 5 years experience at least to do all that work. And the new standard says now you also have to be, used to be able to go in the field and be anybody, fresh out of college, whatever, which is sadly what most of us did in the field and called back to our bosses all the time asking, what is this thing? But now you have to have, you have to be an EP or under an EP during the site visit. So yeah, it is for the cost, which I won't say because it varies across the board, obviously. Yep. But there it's so minimal compared to the protection that you get from getting one done. That it is pretty intensive as far as even just traveling to a site, right? And say it's an hour there, an hour back, an hour on site. That's 3 hours. Of time.
What's your territory?
So my territory goes all the way over to Philly, I typically don't go into New Jersey, not just for travel time, but they have their own particular environmental requirements. And so I say it's about a 2.5-hour radius from my home base, which is in Hanover. So I get down into Maryland, DC, past Chambersburg. You don't get too far north, but, I've gone to Williamsport for some projects. So some of it depends on client and how big the project is, but that's my standard.
So if I called you today, what's the standard lead time that you've seen since you've had your business?
So if you called me today, I actually just had this call this morning. If you called me today, I could get started, right? So it's a whole process, and some things take time. I could get started tomorrow requesting the records, and then it takes, I say, 3 to 4 weeks, 15 to 20 business days. And a lot of that is the lead time for, say, the DEP, right? They say take 2 weeks to get back to me whether they have records. So that's the process.
So it's about a month.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Yep.
And then the phase 2s are when, I had that happen. It was a car dealership. So, and there was a floor drain in one of the garages. So that sparked, it had to have a phase 2. So that's more when you see something that, tank's been removed or not removed, and you don't have good paperwork from DEP. That's what kind of sparks a phase 2.
Yeah, anything that comes up as a concern. So the phase 1, I should have said this before, the intent is to identify recognized environmental conditions. So something that's a concern that you need to look into associated with hazardous substances, hazardous waste, petroleum products, or petroleum waste. So there is a very specific niche of things that we're looking for. We're not going to look for, is there, I don't know, dirt there, right? Whatever it is.
Right.
I'm not looking for, is there calcium in the water, right? That's not me. So yeah, that is what a phase 2 is, right? I've identified that there's a concern. And in order to continue qualifying for that liability coverage, you have to follow up on whatever recs are identified. Whether that's with a phase 1 provider or another company, it does need to be followed up on and addressed so that you can either say, no, it's not a concern, or yes, it is a concern. And that's when the sampling occurs.
It's interesting to me, having been in several properties, sometimes you show up for a listing and you just cringe when you see 55-gallon drums sitting there, what's in those, or above ground tanks, and then I've sold properties or seen properties sold that had a lot of things I would think were concerns, and I don't even think they did a phase 1. I'm sometimes you shake your head.
Yeah. I've done phase 1s on properties that people are like, oh gosh, why would you ever buy that? A gas station. So I did a phase 1. I said, at this point in time, there are no recs. It's in compliance. The tanks are relatively new. Maybe they've closed out a historic issue in the past. There are no current concerns based on what I see. Obviously, you can't predict the future.
Right.
And then I've done office buildings where they wouldn't, most buyers would be like, it's an old office building. I'm not worried about it. And I was like, guys, this was a gas station, and there are still tanks probably in the ground. And there were, there was 6 in the parking lot. So there are just properties that you just can't anticipate there being an issue sometimes. And there are. And then there's those that look really scary that are fine.
Have you found any crazy, things you didn't expect?
Always.
Always.
Yeah. Well, I worked a decent portion of my career. I was in the Philadelphia market, so in Southeast. And some of my most favorite projects were down Center City, Philadelphia, right? Because once you start digging in the ground, you just never know what you're going to find. I did find a treasure, I thought it was a treasure box once, right? Pulled up, it looked like a treasure box. There's nothing in there but an old pot and pan right there. I was like,
funny.
Why is this in the ground? But, I have found made-in-place tanks from old rail cars. So that's always questionable. So yeah, there's been some very interesting things.
When did the regulations get better about tanks? Because these used to be pretty lax.
Yeah, so 89 technically is when they were passed. They weren't really super implemented until the early 90s, giving people a little bit of a window. So if you're looking at a property, right, and you come get a phase 1 and they say, hey, there were tanks here, but they were closed in the 70s, in the 80s, even the early 90s, there may not be any records for them. And that's going to come back as a concern. So heads up to everybody who does a phase 1 and phase 2, keep them forever.
Keep your records.
Keep your records forever.
Yeah.
It will help you when it comes time to sell that property.
Well, and there was a time when gas stations, every single one was replacing all their tanks. So maybe it was about then?
Yep, right around that time.
Okay.
Yeah, about that time, they were either replacing their tanks or pulling them out before regulations were implemented, right? Requiring them to do so.
Okay.
Pulling them out and just continuing without tanks. They would turn into the local convenience store.
Interesting. Huh.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yes.
So, Angela, how much do you do with land development? I mean, it seems like most of the examples you've used so far, you're kind of in a building that's existing. What is the land development process different with your phase ones? What sort of things come up? We know land development can be a long process.
Yes,
and
it
a lot
is.
of things can come up. So, if you're willing to speak to a little bit to us about that process.
That's great. So I do a decent amount of land development work. It's just more interesting when you're in a building, right?
Sure.
Instead of walking out to a farm field.
Yeah.
But some of the redevelopment and new fresh development issues that I see come up are typically the old farm dump, right? Yeah. If we all grew up in the country, we all know there's farm dumps at every farm. Maybe you're lucky and the part you're looking for has been subdivided and the dump's somewhere else on the property. But when you're walking around those old properties, those are things you run into. The barn where they did all the repair for their tractors, where they stored their chemicals, right? Their pesticides and herbicides, kind of where I grew up in the country and my dad was a manufacturing mechanic, right? So we all know there was just drums of PCB hanging out in places to clean their equipment off with. And farmers, they're handy, right? So they fix all their own stuff. So there's always a barn somewhere where they did all that stuff. Usually then they're rural, so they have a septic system. So that's something to think about as well, right? Was that barn and the floor drains, are there drains? Did they drain directly to the ground or did they go to the septic system? Kind of those are things to think of when you're doing development of kind of raw land. I'm trying to think of like some other examples.
Well, do you get involved in like brownfields at all?
So brownfields, they were something, right? You want them to
Something
be
bad.
new. Yeah, usually something bad. There's contamination that you're aware of. So the point when I get involved right now is someone's looking to buy that property and they need to get an understanding of what their either continued future needs are. If it's been closed, maybe they need to maintain a cap in a certain location, but they need to know where that cap is, right? So I'm able to direct them to, here's the location that you can't touch, or you have to put an additional 3 feet of soil on top. You need to maintain that parking lot in that area, whatever the case may be. Even to the point where you're actually required to do a pump and treat system for the groundwater at this location. Nobody's drinking it, but you have to remediate it and you have to maintain it and continue the process in compliance with DEP requirements. So if you're doing a brownfield, that's kind of the part where I would be involved. If you're doing grant work, I would typically team with a larger engineer, environmental company, to kind of give them that phase 1, phase 2 portion of the work. As WBE, that's helpful typically for some of the larger firms. So I would get involved kind of helping them get their arms around what the requirements
So if you run into problems, you have vendors you can,
I do.
pass them off to, refer them to.
Yep. And sometimes I team with them. So I have gotten into my phase 2 work. If it gets beyond my small business, capabilities, I have some that I team with, and really I manage the project through the process. And that allows for my client to just have one contact. But I also, have no problem passing it off to another client as long as they're comfortable working with me, saying here's what the concerns are.
I've seen a couple sites where they've had to do remediation, and boy, it is time consuming, expensive.
It is very expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been interesting to see how that works. You don't run into a lot, but
yeah,
a few times I have, it's memorable.
Yeah. Sometimes they just decide to walk away if they get to that point. And that's, everybody has a different risk tolerance level.
Or you have the seller that decides that they'll do the remediation.
Right.
Or they sell the property for like nothing.
to someone else.
And they still maintain they still take care of the remediation.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, a lot of times what we recommend, like doing a phase 2, it wants to be a buyer, right? The buyer should be the one getting that protection from it, but typically the buyers don't want to pay for it.
Right.
Since it is a seller issue, right? The seller may be the one taking the hit on it.
Yeah.
Now the seller doesn't always want to know though, right?
Yes.
That
Don't tell me.
Yeah.
If you find something bad, don't tell me.
Do it, I'll pay for it, but don't tell me, right? Like
Right.
that's the hard part, right? Having that conversation with them about who needs to know what.
The reality.
You talked about grant work a little bit. Since these remediation projects are so expensive, but the reality is like we have to reuse land space, right? Like we can't there's not an infinite amount of land. At some point we have to reuse space. What are the grant programs that you know of, and how would developers kind of work with you and the state and to do some of this brownfield and remedial kind of work?
Yeah. So that's kind of a sticky web, right?
Yeah.
Everybody wants to have the money, but it's hard to apply for. So it's not exactly straightforward as to who has the money all the time. If you're looking for grant funding, I suggest going to the EDCs in the area, going to the counties and saying, I'm looking to do this property. What's out there? What do you have open? What's available? A lot of times they will have something and they'll be aware of kind of where the grants are and how to apply for them.
The county economic development is the main place to go.
Yeah. There are EPA, DEP, brownfield grants, but they are hard to get. And typically they are implemented by local EDCs. So they will be the ones that are aware whether they have the grant funding available.
I'm curious. I've been watching this project that I thought would have taken off by now because I know what it's going to be. And nothing's happening. So I'm guessing that they're doing some cleanup or there's some issues. Is there like a site that you could go to look that up? Or I just call you and say, what do you know?
Probably just easier to call me. So if there's been a release reported, it's called a notice of contamination. So if the DEP has received this, it takes them a little bit of time, but you can find it on their website. They have a couple of resources for that. If it's not going through, so Act 2, which is the DEP's Chapter 250, if they're going through that, technically it's voluntary. So they don't have to report anything until maybe it's even cleaned up or at all. It's just whether or not they're looking for the release of liability that the DEP would give them. If it's a tank thing and it's required, that'll all be in there because if not, they'll be fined heavily for not doing it. But it's not an immediate thing. Obviously, it takes people time to put things into databases. So that is where you would get it.
Yeah, but it's that realtor in me.
Yeah.
So do you ever run into, I guess this is probably your area of expertise, if somebody has a stream that they might relocate a little bit because it's causing flooding or something? Do you get involved in that at all? Like the monitoring and
so that is what I will call and I can say this because I'm in the environmental world, the bugs and bunny side of the environmental world.
Okay.
That actually is slightly different.
Okay.
And that would require all different types of permits and dealing with the conservation district.
It's a lot.
DEP. Yeah. So because the environmental world is such a wide breadth of experience and expertise, that is kind of in a separate portion of, I don't get involved in that.
So I had a piece of land where we were waiting for a bog turtle study. Is that something you do?
Bugs and bunnies and turtles, right? And turtles.
Okay. So any little animals.
Yeah, I should throw turtles in there.
Yeah, because they're kind of cute.
Because they're everywhere. And
okay, so it's kind of any kind of animal.
Yeah, that's more of the ecological side.
Okay.
I deal more in the chemical side.
There's a lot to know.
Yeah, there's a lot of things.
Do you have to wear like a respirator or something?
I have.
Yeah, you want to protect your own health, right?
Yeah, I have. I've worked doing drum sampling, so I had the whole hazmat suit on. I don't want to do that again.
Yeah.
As a 5'2" maybe with heels on person, the Tyvek suits don't fit me very well, as well as the other 6 foot guys, right? Yeah. So I'm like duct taped into these suits. It's not fun.
You're 5'2"?
If I'm lucky.
Your husband's tall, right?
Yeah, he's 6'5".
Wow, that's so funny.
Yeah, well, our kids will just balance out.
Yeah, be interesting to see what height they are.
Yeah.
I was listed a building for sale once. It was vacant, and I met the owner there, and she handed me a mask, and I'm like, oh, Mold, great.
Yes.
Great.
So, Angela, just since you're out doing this every day, right? What sort of development are you seeing be really common in the area? What kind of projects are most often coming across your plate? Whatever you're allowed to share.
Yeah, that's
but
fine.
just kind of trends that you're seeing in the industry.
So I will say land development type work. The most common thing I'm seeing is townhomes, multifamily. I think I do see some single family. A lot of times they're in the same development, right? Different bits and pieces of different types of houses. I have not seen a lot of commercial, right? New development. And that may just be the clients and contacts that I have, right? Those that are already developed and getting redeveloped or just sold and, bought and sold are, I will say, most common recently is mechanics, auto repair shops, car dealerships. It's been pretty common recently. I'm not exactly sure why. I think people are getting ready to retire, and I've seen a lot of that recently. And I think maybe they've finally gotten their house in order after COVID and kind of went, I think it's time. I'm ready to retire. Let me just hand this off to someone else. And they do typically stay in the mechanic arena, whether they change from auto body to repairs, whatever it is.
Makes sense that you would be looking at those kinds.
Yes,
of
I do
too.
see a lot of strip malls as well.
Okay.
Changing hands and being investment properties, which I find interesting. You guys probably have more insight on that, but more of the strip mall process, which is important to look at as well for the ever so fun dry cleaning properties that may have been there.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
Do owners ever hire you, or is it typically the buyer or the buyer's bank?
typically it's the buyers or the buyer's bank, the developers. I have worked with owners getting ready to sell, thinking that will help speed up the process, especially if they have a concern that they think their buyers are going to be concerned with.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen very often because a lot of times they don't want to know.
Yeah.
So I know just in general, the word environmental, green, all that stuff's been kind of new in the last 30 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you didn't see a lot of it before that. So what are ways that you've seen developers, investors, and construction companies kind of shifting the way that they do business towards knowing that, hey, if someone's going to come in and do a phase 1 or need to do a phase 2, like how do we prevent that? Or how do we sort of work in ways that even just work towards environmental protection and being conscientious of the impact?
Yeah. So from my portion of the environmental world,
Yeah, sure.
and the types of properties that I look at, I have seen more, I say mechanics and auto repair guys and maintenance facilities maintaining their house better, right? Their housekeeping is much better. If they don't just kind of make a spill and leave it there, wash it down the floor drains, right? That sort of thing. I have found that just in the last almost 20 years, things have changed. So I'm about 19 years in, right? So you have a little bit of perspective there. I don't get into a lot of the, I'll say, green spaces, right? I don't look at a lot of LEED buildings. That would be really interesting. I do see a lot more solar panel fields happening, which is a different type of green, right? It's a use, and it's an interesting use for properties. And the agricultural uses, they're, more maintenance of those farms in a more organic manner is, I'm seeing a lot of that as well. They're like, oh, we don't use that, or we don't use those harsh chemicals. We just kind of figure out another way. But I don't get into a lot of the, right, how do they, since I'm not usually on the development part or the future planning part, I'm more on the lines of, well, I'm going to buy this, what now, right? So I don't get into a lot of the future planning of those projects, but I know there are a couple, I do have a multifamily and single-family residential developer that I work with that they do install the electric car chargers in their parking lots.
Is there any environmental issue there?
Not with the electrical chargers. Obviously, with the generation, they have the electric, but that's a different story.
Yeah. I'm curious, out of all the phase 1s you've done, how many percentage end up being like bad that would have to be a phase 2? Was it pretty small or?
I'll say probably about 50%.
Oh, it's not much.
Yeah. So it seems kind of high. And I'll say it skews based on, right, year to year, based on what type of clients I have. If you're looking at someone that does mostly bank work, it's going to be lower. And that's because if you're going to get lending from a bank, you're probably doing an office building or maybe a mechanic shop, right? But when you're looking at it, it's going to skew towards more of the safe options. Banks aren't going to lend on it typically unless it's more of an easy option. The ones that are a little more difficult, there's a lot more planning that goes into it. Maybe they're getting grant work. So if you're doing less bank work, you're gonna kind of skew over to the other side where it's a cash deal and they're saying, I'm comfortable taking some risk on that type of property.
Right. Interesting.
That is really interesting.
I wouldn't have guessed it was that high.
It's give or take. I think in the years I've been doing it, there's been years where I was like maybe 30% is more of an average, and then this past year it's been a little bit more because I've had different types of clients.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, it just depends.
And when you do a phase 2, so if a phase 1's roughly a month lead time, I mean, how long do those take?
Phase 2, I would say, is between 5 and 7 weeks.
Okay.
The lab itself, to get the results back, takes, as a standard turn, about 10 to 14 days.
So it's not
really
terrible.
Yeah, it's not terrible.
Yeah.
Some of it is also how long does it take to get the results back? How long does it take to get on the driller's schedule? Because they have a schedule as well.
Do you pick the sites they drill?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So the recommendations are, we need to look at this location. I usually do a geophysics on every property, and that's for protection. Hey, we're not going to run into utilities. That gas line, I want nothing to do with it, right? Maybe.
So you have to even map out where all that is.
You have to map out where all that is so you don't run into it. And as well as if you're looking for a tank, you want to know where it is.
Yeah.
You have to look for the boundaries, or, if there was a tank there, is there an old excavation pit you can drill down through? So that's, not only is it for accuracy and precision, it's for safety.
Do you ever use PA1 call? Or
Always. Anytime we pump
even
into the ground.
farmland?
Yeah. Anytime you're disturbing or going down into the ground. Yeah. And the drillers are usually the ones that do that.
How far do they drill, or does it vary?
It varies, but usually it's 20-ish feet down.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So
far.
it depends on what you're looking for and if you're going to refusal or if you're like, I'm just looking for the bottom of this tank pit.
So if you're drilling 20 feet, how big's your sample?
Yeah.
The sample itself?
I feel like I could talk to you all day.
I know, right?
It's so
Let me tell
fascinating.
you more. So the sample itself really just fills a jar. So
Okay,
it's,
like a
just
mason jar?
Yeah, it's a jar this big, and then you have a sample like this big to sample for the volatiles. So it's really not much. But when you pull it up out of the ground, it comes up in a big core. So it's 4 foot long and a couple inches diameter. So the sample itself is small. So you're looking for specific things to determine where you're going to sample. If I'm sample for underneath the tank, I got to look. I'm not going to look at the top 8 feet probably. I'm going to look for underneath where the tank was.
So you're going to just try to miss the tank and go down?
Yep, down the edges. Yep.
And then, have you ever done a sample where you actually can smell petroleum or something?
Oh, yes. Yes. I've collected groundwater where there's feet of product laying on top of the groundwater.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So you run into the ones where I did car wash property and the groundwater was green from the tire cleaner back in the day, right? It was green and bubbly from the soap, right? So it was very interesting. You run into some very interesting things. I worked on a property where there was an old paint manufacturer and the soil was all sorts of colors.
That is funny.
man.
So no 2 days are the same for you either.
No, everything's interesting.
Yeah. Wow.
Do your boys have any interest? I know they're little, but
Not necessarily in what I do. Yeah.
not yet. They probably will because it's kind of cool.
Yeah.
What are your favorite parts of your job, Angela?
I like the research. I think my favorite part is knowing that I am going to hopefully help the buyer know what they're getting themselves into. I think that's the reason why I do what I do. It's not, to find the next thing. If I find it, it's important. It's, talking to the buyer, talking them through what their liability may be. Do they want to take the risk? Do they want to move forward? How does that change their development? You know, is it going to increase their cost or their time that it's going to take them to develop or redevelop this property? I think it's the research and the consultation, right? Getting to help the buyer know what they're getting themselves into.
Cool.
So you always know what the buyer's going to do, and then you always interview the seller. And do you interview neighbors too, or it depends?
The only time we're required to interview neighbors is if it's a vacant, abandoned property.
Oh, okay.
So if it's a vacant property, that's fine, right? But if there's no one available, right, the seller's not available. Maybe they're deceased, or they're just not around. You can't get a hold of them at all. That does not happen very often. So it's not very often you go to the neighbors and say, hey, what do you know? But if you run into the situation, a lot of times I will talk to the township and say, hey, old zoning guy who's been here for 100 years, it seems like, right? Do you remember? Somehow they remember. I can't remember the town I grew up in. I was there for 18 years, right? And I can't remember what was on the corner, but somehow these zoning guys remember.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, that's amazing. So Angela, what advice would you give to someone who's in your field, young, getting started? What would you tell them to kind of help them on their way?
Yeah. So I would say the environmental field is a big world. Get all the different experiences and decide what it is that you like to do. And know that there's a company out there for you. I've been at a few of them and then decided to start my own. But I had a wide variety of experiences and realized that, this is where I like to be. I like to be at the beginning. I like to help, and I like to focus on the chemical side. I have a biology degree, right? You'd think that I'd be doing the bugs and bunnies and turtles, But there was just something about it that didn't spark in me, and this does. So I think, getting the experience, figuring out what realm of the environmental world that you like. I mean, there's so many new things since I started and since I graduated. Like sustainability wasn't a thing, right? So, there's just so many new avenues you can go down.
Do you see very many women in your field?
I do see women in my field. It's not as many. I think the difference is there are a lot of women in the lower and middle management area, but not a lot of leaders. And I'd love to see more of that. I think as traditional family roles happen upon women, right? And we make that choice. Mom guilt's a real thing. You guys know that. It's something that we have to work through, realizing. I think COVID has made a big difference in realizing that people have families and other things that we like to do with our life.
Right.
And that just because we have a family doesn't mean we can't do all these other awesome things and be leaders.
Yeah.
They used to always talk about balance, but the word I heard recently that kind of struck with me is just you try to find harmony
Yes.
in both worlds.
Yeah.
Best you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Angela, we have a question we ask all of our guests to wrap up our different recording sessions. So if you could go back and start your career over, but keep all the knowledge and experience you have, is there anything that you would do differently, and what?
Yeah, I think that going back, I wouldn't change any of my experiences. I've always been the one to say, oh, you got a new project? Let me help you. Oh, that's a new thing? Let me try that. Oh, you're overbooked? Let me jump in. That's given me all the experiences that I have currently. The one thing that I would change is thinking about what I do now in my day-to-day is I would have taken up the marketing person's offer to take me along. I would have taken up, the training that was, offered, or I would have read that book they suggested. I do a lot of client relations, a lot of marketing and networking now that I just do it by feel, right? I feel like this is the right thing to do. Maybe I have decent instinct for it, but I think I don't have a training in that, right? I don't have a business or marketing degree. So some of that is doing it by feel. But as I grow, I think it would have been much more helpful to have some experience in that.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah.
Do you ever take on interns? Have you ever done that?
I have not, no.
Yeah. It's a very specific, field that you have to study.
Yeah, and it's interesting as to do this work, you have to be an EP. So you have to have that 5 years experience and a degree.
Wow.
Now you could take someone on and teach them the ropes and, kind of just let them know what's going on. They can do, I do have an admin that does, the records request, because that's not a required EP task. Kind of doing some of the research, you could train someone to do that. But in order to actually do a majority of the work, it would be hard to bring on an intern.
Yeah, but you could maybe probably get some job shadowing if people hear what you do and want to learn more.
What is it that you do?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for giving us some of your time and being on as a guest today, Angela. It's really fun to hear about your life and your work.
Thank you.
I learned a lot.
Yeah.
So.
I'm always open for more conversations. Anybody will tell you that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was Angela Price sharing her insights as environmental consulting, Phase 1 environmental site assessments, and their impact on the process of land development and redevelopment. For more information on Angela, her company, Juniper Environmental, or to learn more about SVN Latus, click the links in the show notes. Thanks for listening to Beyond the Deal.